This video is sponsored by NordVPN. Dungeons have been a staple in the Zelda series ever since the NES days. What started as rooms filled with enemies and basic puzzles soon turned into complex labyrinths, all unique with their designs. Whether it be exploring an abandoned mansion on the freezing mountains of Snow Peak, or uncovering the dark secrets of the royal family, located deep below Kakariko Village inside the Shadow Temple, said to hold Hyrule's bloody history of greed and hatred. In fact, one of the biggest criticisms Breath of the Wild faces is its approach to dungeons. There's less of a focus on them as the game prioritizes its open world and freedom, and while many people greatly enjoyed this title, it's safe to say that the majority are hoping for the series to go back to its roots when it comes to traditional Zelda dungeons. There's just something about Zelda's dungeon portions that makes it so memorable. It could be the overall aesthetic, boss, or as simple as the music. I don't know if you've noticed, but ever since my Zonai documentary, I've been obsessed with the Faith Shrine theme from the Link's Awakening remake. I wouldn't be surprised if it was playing right now. And chances are that, even if you're not a fan of a certain Zelda game, there's still that one dungeon you love going back to time and time again. And although there's much controversy surrounding Skyward Sword and its linear design, it has some of the best dungeons in the series. And today, I'll be listing them in order of least to most favorite. Full disclaimer that this is my opinion, and feel free to post your own dungeon ranking in the comments below, as well as why you agree or disagree with my list. It goes without saying that with any list, there needs to be something at the very bottom. While Skyview Temple is my least favorite dungeon in the game, it's by no means terrible. It falls under the category of that first dungeon in the game, and those tend to be more about teaching the player the basics as opposed to trying to be a memorable dungeon. But I definitely don't think that it's as good as something such as the Great Deku Tree. That dungeon really sells the whole inside a massive tree aesthetic with its vertical layout, combined with puzzles that provide the perfect level of challenge for a beginning dungeon. Skyview Temple, on the other hand, is alright. It has the proper size and length of a starter dungeon, although I find the first half to be lackluster and uninspired. It revolves around the player finding and activating hidden switches, and a part of it feels like it's trying to be a water dungeon as it incorporates that into the puzzle. These parts of the temple feel phoned in compared to the rest, and the quote-unquote hint to solving this puzzle couldn't be any more obvious. Gaze upon your map until your eyes find the X, for it is there that you must strike a glittering gemstone to reveal a path. Wow, what a challenging riddle. I can't even imagine what you're supposed to do here. On the bright side, everything else from the mini-boss onward is a huge improvement, and that's mostly due to the dungeon's key item, the beetle. This thing is awesome. Definitely one of my favorite items in the whole series, and even though you don't get all of its features until LANAYRU Desert, it offers enough to make the second half of Skyview Temple enjoyable. There's this odd sense of satisfaction when you use it against the enemies. I think that if they just gave you this item much earlier into the dungeon and built all of its puzzles around the beetle, Skyview Temple would be much higher on this list. Also, the spider webs are incredibly annoying. I swear that it's impossible to cut through them completely, and I always end up getting stuck. And you're forced to revisit this temple later on in the game, which doesn't really help with its case. It leaves you with a bad impression of it since it doesn't do anything new or interesting. At least it ends off with a great boss fight. Most starting dungeons in Zelda games have incredibly easy boss battles, and that's why this one in particular is so memorable. It provides quite the challenge considering it's the first main boss in the game, as opposed to something like Goma. Skyward Sword's Earth Temple takes the number 6 spot on this list. Personally speaking, I find the overall aesthetic of this dungeon to be a lot better than Skyview's, with all the monster statues and loose ties to Buddhism. A good portion of the dungeon is spent on a rolling ball, allowing you to traverse through the lava. It opens up parts of the level that, under normal circumstances, would be inaccessible.
Oh my gosh, is that a Zonai swirl?
But I feel like the Earth Temple only scratches the surface of this mechanic, since most segments involving the ball are entirely linear. You ride down a path, stop and do a small puzzle to open the way ahead, rinse and repeat. It wouldn't hurt to give the player a bit more freedom in these segments, and maybe add more puzzles which utilize this mechanic. And this linearity continues throughout the rest of the dungeon. It kind of feels like they gave up near the end, as the last couple rooms aren't that engaging. There's this frustrating timing-based puzzle involving bombs, and you get the boss key in the same room as the boss door. There's nothing wrong with the boulder sequence, but perhaps rework it so the key is in a separate series of rooms with their own puzzles. And the boss at the end of the Earth Temple is uninspired, to say the least. It's essentially a reskinned Dodongo fight. It would have been a lot better if they made a baby Dodongo enemy instead. It could even replace the Lizalfos as mini-boss of the dungeon, or just be an enemy found exclusively in this temple. Its weakness would be bombs, just like Ocarina of Time, and then you have something else be the dungeon boss. Since the Earth Temple is filled with dragon imagery, why not just make the boss itself a dragon? Perhaps Girahim uses his dark magic to make one of the statues come to life, similar to Koloktos. That way, there's an excuse to include bombs in the fight without being a reskinned Ocarina of Time boss. I think the biggest problem with this dungeon is the fact that they divided the fire-lava theme between two separate temples in the game, so a lot of the gameplay mechanics that could have been included in the Earth Temple were saved for the Fire Sanctuary. But hey, at least it's satisfying to squish those enemies with your massive balls. Wait a second, that didn't come out right. I consider Eldin's Fire Sanctuary to be a better version of the Earth Temple. Its main gimmick is similar to one of the puzzles in Wind Waker's Dragon Roost Cavern, but expands on it. And the overall design of this dungeon is very solid. In the first room, you're forced to hit this plant, which drops water on the lava, creating a platform for the player to cross. By doing so, it acts as a quick tutorial of how the player can use this mechanic to clear the upcoming dungeon puzzles. It's kind of like how you're forced to climb before leaving the Shrine of Resurrection in Breath of the Wild. The Fire Sanctuary expands on this mechanic as you proceed deeper in the temple, whether it be using the lava current to traverse through the multiple rooms, or stabbing and throwing the fruit with your sword. And the mini-boss portions are interesting because they also act as a sort of puzzle since you use them to access higher parts of the room. In fact, there's two different Megmanos rooms in the Fire Sanctuary. The first one you can't kill, but in the second room you get access to the same water plants used for the temple puzzles. Not only are they useful for clearing the dungeon, but are also used to kill the Megmanos in the room. Knowing this, the player can backtrack to the first mini-boss chamber, use the digging mitts to open this door, and proceed to kill the first one, unlocking a hidden chamber that has a bottle in a chest. This whole sequence is very creative since the player is able to use this knowledge to go back to a previous part of the level and is rewarded for doing so. And on the topic of the digging mitts, using them to open and close gates underground was a very interesting concept. One of my favorite moments was when you unclogged the lava flow underground, and then proceeded to run away as it slowly chased you. My two biggest complaints about this dungeon is its similarity to the Earth Temple and the boss fight. There's nothing in particular that's technically wrong with the Girahim fight, but when you include the first and final battles with him, that's 3 whole boss slots taken up. It would have been much better if you fought him at the beginning and end of your journey, and the Fire Sanctuary had its own exclusive boss. Maybe you could fight the giant lava creature responsible for the hands in the mini-boss rooms. That way you could incorporate the water plants in the battle. And as said before, the second issue with the Fire Sanctuary is its similarity to the Earth Temple. It would have been way better if the mechanics of both fire lava dungeons were combined into a single temple, and have the second one be a different theme. I understand that we're in Eldin, a volcanic region, but take Faron for example. While 2 dungeons are in this region, both focus on different styles, a forest and water temple. If the same was done with Eldin's dungeons, it would have made both levels stand out a whole lot more. Now we're moving on to the dungeons that I absolutely love. But before that, a quick word from the sponsor of today's video, NordVPN. If you're someone who frequently uses the internet, then getting a VPN is a must. Not only does it encrypt your personal data when shopping online or browsing social media, but it also allows you to bypass region-blocked content such as movies or anime shows. And if you go to the link in the description, nordvpn.com/NintendoBC, you can sign up for a 2-year plan, not only at a huge discount, but will also receive 4 additional months for free. With just a single click, you can connect to one of the 5,400 plus servers available in 59 different countries. And up to 6 devices can be used with one account. You get worldwide access to all content, whether it be entertainment, work-related, or shopping, all while keeping your private information safe from ISPs or hackers. And NordVPN's strict no-logs policy means that none of this information is collected nor shared, allowing you to browse the internet without having to worry about data leaks. Not only that, but there's a 30-day money-back guarantee in case you're not satisfied with what you get. So head to nordvpn.com/NintendoBC right now for a discounted 2-year plan with an additional 4 months. That's nordvpn.com/NINTENDOBC. Thanks again to NordVPN for sponsoring this episode, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. Can I just start off by saying that timeshift stones are an amazing concept and absolutely need to return for a future Zelda game? It really says something when you have a game mechanic used in an entire region, as well as the 2 dungeons in said region, and yet you still are craving more of it. In many ways, timeshift stones are what carry this part of the game, and that's why LANAYRU Mining Facility is number 4 on this list. It's cool because at times it feels like 2 separate dungeons in one. Everything starts out as broken down and abandoned, with dust covering the surface, but the moment you strike the timeshift stone, you get a glimpse of what this facility used to look like. A bright, colorful environment filled with different mechanisms and machines. The whole dungeon feels alive, and you can even see ore moving along the conveyor belts. Even the music changes based on what era you're in. Unlike the SKYVIEW and Earth temples, it's as if this place is trying to tell you a story. It's not just here to provide a challenge to the player, it directly ties into the region's history told by the ancient robots inhabiting the land. They are the ones responsible for mining the timeshift stones, and it's that very reason why LANAYRU takes on the appearance of a vast desert. The depletion of natural resources combined with the climate change left the robots and their technology in a state of disrepair. And despite this dungeon being very linear, it does a pretty good job in hiding this with its layout. You'll find yourself returning to the same room over and over again, but each time you either enter through a different section, or use the timeshift stones to do things that would otherwise be impossible to accomplish in the present. And while you do this, you can open up shortcuts, making any necessary backtracking a whole lot easier. By the time you reach the boss door, you could go out of the dungeon, recover your hearts, and return in less than a couple minutes. Something that I did in my livestream of Hero Mode for Skyward Sword HG. You should totally check it out. I will admit that this temple's key item didn't feel fully utilized. The gust bellows are used to blow dust and enemies away, along with activating certain mechanisms. There should have been a way to toggle between blowing air out and sucking it in similar to Minish Cap. That would add way more variety to the puzzles and make its use in the boss fight a lot more interesting. And Moldarok is a very boring battle. In fact, I'd put it below Scaldera since that one feels more engaging with how it chases you up the arena. And worst of all, you're forced to refight Moldarok at the LANAYRU shipyard. Personally speaking, I think it works much better here as a mini-boss. Then you could have something else act as the final challenge for the mining facility. Since many of the machines you fight are said to be guardians of the facility, you could make something along the lines of Godin or Mazal, a boss that's not necessarily evil, but acts as protector of the dungeon, who tests the hero in combat as a means of proving his worth. Aside from that complaint, the only others are that, 1, the mining facility is a bit too long of a dungeon. There are some rooms that could have been cut out from the final version, or at least have a bit less backtracking in the dungeon. Plus, there's no mini-boss to fight here. You just get the gust bellows from one of the rooms without much resistance. But even with these flaws, it's still a very fun dungeon to complete, and I look forward to it every time I replay the game. The SANDSHIP has to be the most unique dungeon of the bunch. Most temples in the Zelda series take on the appearance of, well, exactly that, temples. But the SANDSHIP, true to its name, is quite literally a giant ship sailing across the LANAYRU Sand Sea. The player teams up with the former captain of the vessel, an ancient robot named Skipper, who requests that you save his crew. And while Skyward Sword's overall gameplay consists of much more linearity compared to other titles, the SANDSHIP is one of 2 dungeons in the game that gives the player a sense of freedom while completing it. In fact, the overall goal is less about reaching an endpoint and more so to restore the ship's power by activating multiple terminals. In a way, it's similar in nature to Breath of the Wild's Divine Beasts. One thing you'll notice while completing the dungeon is that there aren't that many locked doors requiring keys in the SANDSHIP. Instead, this dungeon has one timeshift stone that can be activated or deactivated, allowing access to areas that would otherwise be inaccessible. In fact, you get the key item almost immediately after entering the SANDSHIP, so the player's essentially equipped with all the necessary tools at the beginning of the level. Combining the timeshift stone mechanics with the bow and arrows was a smart move since it lets the players interact with the timeshift stones regardless of their positioning on the SANDSHIP. On occasions, you'll be below deck in a room where it's possible to activate them thanks to conveniently placed grates in the ceiling. So even though a player is in another part of the level, some of the puzzles will require you to quite literally think outside the box to solve them. It's very refreshing to have a dungeon that's essentially the antithesis of what Skyward Sword is, a game that's often criticized for being far too linear of a Zelda game. One problem I faced when I first played through the SANDSHIP was that at times I felt sort of lost navigating the multiple hallways, and if you forget to do certain things, it can sometimes lead to time wasted on backtracking. But there are shortcuts the player can open up to make this bit less tedious. And to be honest, these cons are to be expected in a dungeon that gives the player more freedom. The SANDSHIP is one of the shorter dungeons in the game, but that's assuming it's being played by someone who already knows what to do. Honestly, it's the perfect length for a Zelda dungeon once you consider the additional time required to solve these puzzles. Unfortunately, there is one part of the SANDSHIP that's severely lacking compared to the rest of it, and that's the boss fight. To clarify, I'm not talking about the mini-boss. As a matter of fact, SKYVIEW is one of the best mini-bosses in the series, and in many ways, better than the dungeon's boss. Fighting a robot pirate captain while aboard a ship makes so much sense, and unlike other enemies, SKYVIEW has his own backstory that directly ties into the game's lore, explaining why he's the mini-boss of the SANDSHIP. Tantalus, on the other hand, fails to meet the expectations set by the developers themselves. In my opinion, the build-up for this dungeon's boss was phenomenal. Once you enter the main control room, the ship is suddenly attacked by a creature with massive tentacles. This continues as you make your way out of the sinking ship, all while your imagination runs wild thinking about the threat Link will be put up against once he goes through those doors. Will it be a giant kraken-like enemy similar to the one from Pirates of the Caribbean? Surely this will be our most fearsome challenge yet. Wait. That's it? What's with the Monsters Inc. design? It looks like the love child of Celia and Mike Wazowski. I don't know, man. After that whole build-up on the ship, I was expecting something more menacing and threatening looking, not a character that looks like it belongs in a Walt Disney film. It's definitely the biggest flaw of the SANDSHIP, and is what prevents this dungeon from ranking any higher on the list. I'm sure that for some people this would be lower on the worst to best dungeons list, but I really love Skykeep. It's Skyward Sword's final challenge before you face off with Girahim and Demise, and it throws everything at you at once. The player navigates 8 different rooms in search for the Triforce, with each room styled after the 6 previous dungeons. This gives the Skykeep a ton of variety when it comes to aesthetics and puzzles, as it depends on what room the player is currently in. And this dungeon is the one that gives the player the most freedom thanks to its gameplay mechanic, where you can change the layout of the dungeon by interacting with the numerous terminals scattered across the temple, in the form of a slide puzzle. It's very similar to the Divine Beasts of Breath of the Wild, but instead of it being a mechanic shared by all dungeons, it's exclusive to the Skykeep, making it stand out compared to the rest. In my opinion, this is why the Divine Beasts suffer. Since all of them use similar mechanics, none in particular stand out. Skykeep does an excellent job in balancing the linear and freedom elements of Zelda in a way that makes it enjoyable. I wouldn't be surprised if the Skykeep is what inspired the Zelda team to later develop Breath of the Wild's dungeons given the similar mechanics. I only have a couple problems with this temple. First off, it could have been a bit longer. Some of the puzzles aren't that difficult. At times, the only real challenge comes from the slide puzzle, but so long as you think it through, even that can be solved rather quickly. Another issue comes from the fact that, since your goal is to collect the 3 pieces of the Triforce, there's no proper dungeon boss at the end. But there is a mini-boss that's essentially a rematch against Skirvo from the SANDSHIP, and since the original fight was so good, it's a lot better than the recycled Moldarok fight. Though it feels like wasted potential in my opinion. Since the Skykeep is based off of all the previous dungeons, there's no exclusive enemies, which could have spiced things up a bit. Other than that, there's nothing else to really say about this dungeon. Overall, it's a very solid final level, but definitely not the best. If there is one dungeon that deserves the #1 spot, it's without a doubt the Ancient Cistern. What can I say that hasn't already been said hundreds of times by others? Its aesthetic is unique with 2 halves of the dungeon contrasting each other, has some awesome music, and is the perfect length for a Zelda temple. At first, the whip seems like a lame item to have, but the dungeon makes full use of it, allowing the player to grapple and swing across ledges, flip over lily pads to use as platforms, activate switches, and yank enemies toward you or steal their items. But most importantly, it ends with one of the best boss fights of the series, a battle against the dungeon's guardian, Kolokdos, where you use the whip to rip off its limbs and later use its own weapons against it. Not only does it incorporate the temple's key item in this fight, but the boss's overall design makes sense given all the connections this temple has to Buddhism, such as the lotus flowers scattered all throughout the ancient cistern, or the massive statue in the central chamber that closely resembles Buddha. There's even a part of the dungeon that was clearly inspired by a short story called The Spider's Thread, of how a sinner almost escaped hell by climbing a spider's thread. One of my absolute favorite parts of the Ancient Cistern has to be the contrasting aesthetic of the top and lower halves, one centered around the feelings of gratitude, with the other focusing on malice and hatred. In fact, there's so much to dissect from this dungeon that I ended up making a whole video on the topic. I highly recommend you check that video out because there's way too much to cover, and since this is a top 10, I can only talk briefly about each temple. But in my opinion, the Ancient Cistern is Skyward Sword's best dungeon, and one of the best in the series. So, that's it. This is my ranking of the worst to best temples in Skyward Sword and Skyward Sword HD. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and let me know what your favorite or least favorite dungeon is in the comments. I've been Nintendo Black Crisis, and I will see you all next time.